And then you also get the elevation along. So.
Okay.
They don't have it down here.
We are getting started here.
Oh, but they're probably up in
Day 2. I'm going to finish what I was going to talk about last night, and then we're going to do a bit of a review. After we do that review, that'll help us to go on to the next phase, which is actually building a model and the steps necessary. You all know how to do interpretation next time, because next time is when we start the lab. We're all going to break up. First of all, we're going to break up into 2 big groups, and then it's going to be 4 smaller groups, and then 3 very small groups, I think, or 2, and then last, you're going to be working alone. So, you get 3, what's that, 3? No, you get 4 labs with other people. No, 3 labs with other people, 1 lab by yourself, and then we're going to do the actual graded
Exam.
exam.
So when we do these things, are you going to give us the answers so we can see if we got it right or not, to make sure that we're doing it correctly?
What I'm going to do is I'll review your results. So when your group's all done and you're all agreed that, yep, this is the interpretation, you'll submit just 1 worksheet for me to look at, and then kind of have, maybe the best person with the best handwriting could actually be that person.
Can we pick our groups?
Then we will, I'll just look at those. That'll help me to adjust anything that seems to be getting missed, especially if there's a consensus of like it's the same error every time. But I have confidence that you all are going to do a great job. So the reality is that as we get going, anytime you're developing a skill, like riding a bike, you're going to be super focused on all the little details. But the better you get at it, the more of that stuff's going to become automatic, and then you're going to be able to do that a lot faster. So the idea here is that we're developing a skill in hermeneutics, we're not just learning about it. Well, first we've got to do is the cognitive portion, which is what we're doing now, which is learning. Let's get in our heads. And then we're pretty sure we got in our heads, and we'll put it in practice. Okay, the last thing we didn't talk about the first night was the last phase of what you're doing. It's really the most important, or the goal of your interpretation, that is application. So
what are the other phases?
Well, the first one was observation. And we'll do a review, by the way. So we'll do a review of all this. Your observation, then we lead that into sort of interpretation. In other words, what was the original intent of the author? What was he trying to get across to the people he was writing to? And then lastly is the application. This is the fun stuff. This is the stuff that we walk away and go, wow, that was so great. I needed that, right? So, at the end of your notes, this will be the last page of your first set of notes. If you brought those with you. And if you didn't, that's okay, I'll read it here. It says, application. What does it mean to me? Okay, that's like the practical definition. What does it mean to me? With the observation and interpretation done, the application is the result, the reason we do any of this. What we want to know is based on the theological principle or command to them, what does that mean to me? So once I figure out that theological principle, that truth statement, or that command, what does that mean to me? One thing you have to realize about applications is they're not fixed. Now, observations are fixed. Interpretation is fixed. It only ever means one thing to the original audience. It didn't mean several things to the original audience. But for the application, it could have differing degrees of application. Why is that?
It depends on where you are in your walk with the Lord.
Okay, personally, where you're at with your walk with the Lord. Okay.
Well, the scenario that you're trying to apply it to is going to have its own unique circumstances that surround it, right? What's going on in my life, what's going on if it's a conflict with a family member or a friend, or where does it fit is, these 2 things, whether it's a commandment or a theological principle, every one of us is going to be walking through life with their own set of different, variables in play. So me applying this for Holly, I could be missing a bunch of different variables, but Holly's going to be able to best determine, when she understands it, how to apply it to her.
Perfect. Exactly right. Does that make sense to everybody? So I like the analogy of a flower. when it comes to this stuff, right? So you have a little flower here. It's got a little stem, okay? It's got a little bowl here. It's got all these little petals. What kind of flower is this? I don't know. Doesn't matter.
That's a daisy.
Is that a daisy? Okay. So the observations, okay, and then the interpretation is up here, right? So there's your observation. One observation, you're going to need singular observations fixed. One interpretation, but your applications may have variables. Okay, there's different variables to an application, how that means something to me. That's why often when we go to the Bible and we have read the same passage again, it hits us in a completely different way. So these are all applications, right? These little petals. And so gotta get them all. That's the idea behind what we're really getting after. And when we draw our model, we can use that. I've got another example of what we might be able to use as a little framework model. But that's something about what we're doing. So there's a really important point here I make too, is application should be active, meaning the reader ought to attempt to make the applications action-based instead of conscious-based. Does that make sense? So if an application is simply, golly, that's a really good theological point, that makes me feel good, that doesn't change our life, does it? So let's say I'm reading through the law and I'm looking at all the ways that Israel offered sacrifices to Yahweh. And I'm looking at the Thanksgiving offering. Okay? Now that doesn't have any direct application to me, does it? I'm not a Jew. There's no temple. I have no way to bring a Thanksgiving offering in that way. But the interpretation here is that this was what God required for a holy people. And this is how he expresses how he wants to be worshipped. So when it comes to us, how does that apply to us? What kind of application might you draw personally from that?
God wants us to be grateful.
Very good. So how might you, that's a conscious one, so that's good. How could we make that action-based?
Praise him.
You could praise him, but again,
Share it with others.
okay, there you go. So in other words, actionable, praise him is just a little abstract.
Okay, tithe.
Okay, you could tithe. Maybe you're like, I don't actually set aside money. I just kind of give whatever I feel like. But what if there's a set standard that I make before me and God, that I'm like, God, I'm giving you this from now on. Okay? That's what happens when we're actually interacting with the Word, and we allow conviction, and we allow that to sort of simmer, and then we come away with an action plan. Or maybe it's like, I'm going to give, I already tithe. Maybe I'm going to give extra this. I'm going to give an extra $100. Because I'm just so grateful for the Lord this week. I've just been so grateful. My friend finally got a chance to share the gospel with him, and he really listened, so the Spirit was there. And I just want to show God how grateful I am by giving more to God to further more mission and kingdom stuff within the church, right?
Can you come up with one that's just not necessarily a monetary base? Like, is there a specific principle or theological principle that is something that we can all think of that you would say, now this is how we take it into action, just outside of time?
Great. How about Matthew 18? Whoever doesn't forgive his brother from his heart isn't forgiven, right? So how might that apply in my life? Is there anyone in my life right now that I haven't forgiven, right? And then saying, I'm going to go and call my dad or my brother or my sister or my friend or my coworker. I'm going to say, you know what? I've been holding a grudge against you, and I want to ask for your forgiveness, or I want to bring that to your attention so that you know I want to reconcile with you. All right? So that's a pretty easy one, all right? So
that's great. I think that's great. That's perfect.
So, just so I can understand, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. So, say you have 3 churches. Say objective is communion. Okay. We all know how to do communion, but we have 3 different churches. One takes it once a month. One takes it every Sunday. Another one takes it every other week.
sure.
So within these 3, these are basic different understandings of how we should be giving our time to the Lord.
Right. So that's a good example. There are some things that we see in the Word as far as application goes. They're not cut and dry in the Bible. It doesn't say how often we're supposed to take communion. Right? It just says, do this as often as you eat in remembrance of me. So how often are we supposed to do it? Are we supposed to do it every day? Every 3 times a day? Are we supposed to, right? So really that's up to the church, and there's no wrong answer to that. The church may do it twice a year. And if a church did it twice a year, you could imagine how important that would be. That moment where you actually go to do that. And so we've, like for instance, our church shows up once a month because we want to have some kind of like happy medium where if you did it every week, it would become maybe routine, maybe it would become something light, and it should be something a little heavier. Maybe it would be heavier if it was once a quarter, I don't know. So it's up to the church. That's not a situation where there's a cut and dry application, but we do know that it's supposed to be somewhat regular. So pick one. Yeah, it's a good question. Okay, so those applications, any other questions regarding application? How does this personally apply to my life? Make those actionable, they're variable. But don't forget, they should be tied, of course, to that interpretation, right? You don't just, read a random passage and then, start applying it any which way you want. We don't want those applications to become emotional or experiential. We want those to be tied to the text. And this is important in preaching or leading a Bible study. There should be a clear line between what you've just said in the interpretation and the application. Sometimes in a Bible study, that's like, you can ask really good questions to get to the bottom of that, right? So instead of maybe saying, here's an application for all this, like maybe you just open it up, right? So given this, and the way that this is written and what this writer was telling these people, what does that mean to us? Right? That's a great question. Right? So what's very important is that we know what was said to them and it's fixed. But then we walk away and we have a really good dialogue within a Bible study or amongst your family or with yourself, that you're actually getting down to a really good actionable application. And that'll preach, right? That's the stuff that really matters. So make those actionable. And of course, when you do your interpretations, I'm going to be looking for actionable application, right? Not just whatever you think. Okay, so thoughts, questions? Okay, we're going to do a review of what we did last week. All right, so there were really 2 big parts of yesterday's lecture. One of them was, how do we know the way we're interpreting Scripture is trustworthy or valid? Okay? Is it because our church fathers told us to do it that way? Is it because we really feel like this is the way we should do it? No, of course, we use 2 different categories that we could rest our interpretation on, our method on, and that was we had axioms of self-evident truths, and we had rules of logic. Okay, so rules of logic. What are the axioms? Okay, maybe 5 of these, and there are 1, 2, 3, 4 of these. Okay, so the axioms. First of them was God uses language to communicate. Okay? You guys remember what the second one was?
Language is a reliable means of communication.
Language is a reliable means of communication. The third one.
The meaning of words is determined by how they are used.
The meaning of words
is determined by how they are used.
Great. And the last one, or I'm sorry, not the last one. This one should be, what? Is it?
The
truth?
object.
The object of interpretation.
Oh, the object of interpretation is the intent of the author?
Just to apprehend the meaning.
Of the
That's
author.
right. The objective of interpretation. This is why it's important that you all had it written down first, is to apprehend the meaning of the author. Okay? And then the last one, truth.
Truth accords with truth.
Accords with truth. Okay, those are the 5 axioms. Now, those axioms are sort of the bedrock of why we do what we do and why we don't mix things around. Typically, something in here is going to be broken if somebody's doing bad hermeneutics, because truth always accords with truth. Of course, we have these rules of logic, right? The law of
Affirmation.
affirmation, negation,
Exclusion.
exclusion, and lastly,
Reason and consequent.
reason and consequent. Okay, reason and consequent. So, now without looking, can anybody tell me what the law of affirmation is? Holly can tell me. What is that?
It's
She drifts towards the paper.
yeah. I don't have my paper, so I can't.
Oh, you don't? You can't even
No.
look. What do you think it is? In Holly's words.
That is that the one that what you read. Thanks.
I know. I was the same way. I'm like, no, I'm a reader.
The thing is what it is.
Yeah, it is.
Which is different than negation, which is
The thing is not what it is.
the thing is not what it
It's
isn't.
not.
Yeah.
Okay? And then exclusion, remember that one?
Oh, only one of 2 things that contradict can be correct.
That's right. Only one of 2 things that contradict can be correct, and then reason and consequent is like
If this and that.
All
yeah.
thought is
this, then that. There you go. All thought
It's
and
rational.
continual thought is rationally linked
Connected.
or connected. Yeah. So those are important. Why are they important?
That's language.
from interpretation.
It's how you read any book.
Exactly. It's the way it is, right? So these are not mind-blowing, and they're not based on 3 things that we do not use for interpretation. Emotion, anything else? 3 things. Emotion,
Your what, personal experience?
personal experience. There's another 3rd one. Tradition, right? Tradition, meaning that we don't just believe it because so-and-so told me, right? So those 3 things we don't use for interpretation. No, ours rests here, okay? So those are important. Those are things you're going to want to remember, because oftentimes we're asked, right, in this culture, like, what makes your interpretation trustworthy? What makes you think you're right in your interpretation? This is why, right? It's not because my church is bigger than your church, right? Or I'm smarter than you are, or I've had more life experience than you have, which is, kind of what Job was dealing with. Remember that series? When Job was confronted by his 3 friends. One was Mr. Goody Two Shoes, one was Mr. Experience, and one was Mr. Intelligent. Right? And so, we'll get back to that in a second. Okay, good. So that's very important. All right, so when it comes to what we talked about, the second phase was like when we really got into kind of observation, interpretation, application. There were 3 big parts of what we observe in a passage. Okay, 3 big things that we observe in a passage. One of them was genre. What's the other thing that we observe in a passage? Anything else? How about
Figures of speech.
yeah, figures of speech, but that's under a category. Come on, man.
Context.
There we go. Hint there. Okay, so genre, grammar, context. Those are the three big observation deals. Okay? Notice that before our first lecture, I didn't write anything down. We're writing all this down now to kind of get this solidified in your brain. Okay, so genre, grammar, context. What genre? What is that? You guys remember?
It's the surrounding.
Style.
Style, okay, yeah. What's the style, right? What are they writing? What are they writing and why are they writing it, right? So, could be poetic, could be instructions, could be narrative history, right? Could be a letter, could be apocrypha stuff.
Parable.
Prophetic, parable. Grammar, we're going to get into that a lot, okay, here in a second. But context, what was context? There's kind of three levels of context that we're looking for. Context of historical, good.
Just cultural, following historical.
Yeah, it does. Historical's one.
The book itself.
There we go. The book itself. Just going to put book, context in the book. And three,
Immediate.
immediate. Have an E on immediate.
Yes.
Thank you. So, that's the way we're looking at context, okay? Big deal. So, this one's kind of fast, right? We figured that one out pretty quick. Shouldn't take too long to figure out the genre of the book, right? Then we have context that we're digging a little bit more, aren't we? And then lastly is grammar. And this one here, you're just gonna love. So, the grammar, let's start the green. Okay, so grammar, there were some important things. One of the most important things I want you to take away from grammar is to know how to use conjunctions. I know, sounds like fun, but it's, when we're talking about conjunctions, we're talking about the different words you would know to be able to differentiate which conjunction is which. I know it sounds like a bunch of garble, but the reality is that if you memorize these, which I encourage you to memorize these conjunctions, because when it comes to when we actually do the interpretation, they're going to pop out to you, okay? They're going to pop out to you when you're watching a stupid Instagram video, you're seeing letters, you're like, oh, conjunction. So there's 7 conjunctions, okay? So you have reason, you have result, right? You have purpose conjunctions,
Contrast.
contrast, opposite of contrast,
Compare.
compare,
If and if then.
yep, if, then, and lastly,
Conditional, oh, emphasis.
emphasis. Great, so, good, so reason, you're going to have words that are conjunction, because is an easy one, right? It was because, for, since,
As.
Whereas.
whereas,
And as.
what's that?
As.
Right, so these are the words, because, for, since, whereas, as. When we see these words, we know that the author is telling us the reason why he wrote the previous statement. Okay? When we go to do our interpretation, which I'm going to demonstrate today, when we go to do the interpretation, we're going to underline all this stuff. Okay? And when we do I'm going to hand out your work packet. When we do the actual labs, it's all going to be printed out. Okay? So you can just underline everything. Make little notations on the side or whatever you want to do, okay? So, there you have that. Now, result is a little easier. There's only 3, right? Then, therefore, thus. Okay, so whenever you see one of these, he's telling you the results, okay, of what he said before. The result is this. Thus, this. Therefore, this. Then, this, right? Now then could be another one. Now then, okay? The result. Now the purpose is got a whole bunch of that in it, right? That, that?
So that.
So that. Great. So you have all these purposes. Whenever you're looking at purpose, we're going to look at an example of this. We're going to look at Romans 11 because Paul is just king of all this stuff. Most of the scriptures you're going to go through, you're not going to be underlining quite so much as you will when you're reading the Apostle Paul. Okay? So we get into contrast. Okay? However, nevertheless, is that one?
Yep.
Yeah.
Nevertheless,
But yet.
However.
However, otherwise. Okay. These are all, again, just to review, these are going to be really important as you're doing your observation. This is grammar observation. It's actually very important. People make big mistakes in interpretation just by not noticing a therefore or a then or thus. They're all important. All those words are very important. Okay, so compare, also, so also, as,
Likewise.
likewise, moreover. Okay? If then is just if then, right? If you see an if and a then, that's a comparison, right? If this is this, right? That's sort of self-evident. So then you have an emphasis, which is like what?
Oh, indeed.
Oh, indeed.
Only.
What did we talk about yesterday? Remember another one Jesus used?
Truly.
Truly.
Surely. Verily. Okay. So those are conjunctions. Okay. Now obviously there's other grammatical things like verbs are obvious. Those are action words. You have what is it called when there's something that's describing the verb?
Adverb.
Adverb. Adjectives and adverbs. I always mix those up. Adverb. What's an adjective? That modifies the.
Describes the noun.
Nice. Right. So then you have adjectives. You have. Pay attention to your tenses. Right. He wasn't running. He ran. Okay. So those are things you're going to notice also. But those are almost always pretty obvious. If you're used to reading, you're used to working with those and understanding the meaning of a text. When it comes to these, however, we don't think a whole lot about these conjunctions. All right, so have those memorized. I'm not going to quiz you on it. If you don't ever want to memorize them and you want to go through the whole lab with your notes with you, that's fine, right? So, but you're not going to be able to have your notes when you go to your final. I want to see how you do without it, okay? So use them as long as you think you need to, but can you see okay? This isn't blocking, is it? Okay. So, great. Any other questions or thoughts on the review of grammar? Yes.
One
Rob.
question, the word as is used both for reason and compare, so will it be obvious from the context which two of those we're discussing?
What was one of our axioms that would apply to that question? Can you remember?
Meaning of the word is determined how they are used.
Right. The meaning of a word is determined by how it's used. So obviously when it comes to an as statement, when it comes to comparing, as it was in the days of Josiah, that is the way, as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be, Jesus says, in the end time. So that would be obviously a comparison. But obviously when it comes to as for reason, okay, actually, reason, yes. As you did so-and-so, blah, blah, blah. Actually, I can't think of a way to use as a reason. Maybe I should have wrote that down.
Whereas.
I think that's in your notes, so just go ahead and scratch that out. Wow, that was really sounded like I knew what I was talking about for a second there, didn't it? Whew. Don't worry, guys. I always reserve the right to be wrong. Okay, so maybe somebody can figure out a way that has. If you can, then you get it. Anyway. Okay, so let's see. That is our review. Okay. Now let's see. You guys want to take a little break before we get into the method? Yes. I think there's some delicious snackish that the Browns have generously given. If you want something to drink, we got water bottles. Let's take whatever I tell you to stop. Okay, let's get into a model, and then from that model we're going to build in our steps, okay? So I'll use your help for this. All right, so I've got a couple of different model ideas. There's one. One.
Wine glass.
And of course, here's our old flower friend. I'm going to put a really big fat stem on this, okay?
Could be a palm tree.
What were our 3 parts of observation?
Genre, grammar, and context.
Nice. Genre. I'm going to go context next, because it's going to be kind of like easier to remember the order. And then you have grammar. There. Okay? Now the idea here is we have everything's kind of funneling down or compressing down to one, what? Who said interpretation?
Interpretation.
Good job. Yeah. So it comes down to one interpretation. Once we have our interpretation, then what do we have?
Application.
Nice. Is that simple? Okay. So the idea of a model is obviously just to get a really basic or generalized idea about what we're doing. Now obviously this would be the same thing. We'd start with what? Genre, then our context, which would lead to our
Grammar.
grammar. Okay. And then that would come up here to a singular interpretation. That's great, isn't it? The whole set. And then that leads to, could be various applications. Of course, when you do your interpretations, you won't have to do multiple applications. One application is fine. So, but make sure it's always tied to your interpretation. Okay? Which model do you like better? Raise your hand if you like this model. Raise your hand if you like this model. Okay, this model it is. The sterile engineering style model wins. The artsy one does not.
Can I add, it's just because I think that doesn't look like a flower, if you had a better...
No, you may not, sir.
Flower is so much cooler. Where is your creative mind, you guys? Come on.
They're not left brain.
There wasn't enough.
That's
It's come down to an application. The other one, you got so many applications, you're going, what am I doing?
So you got application. This makes it maybe a little more basic. You don't have to worry about multiple ones. But you can see how this all
I'd like to change
comes
my vote.
down.
I'd like to change my vote. No, really.
You like the flower one?
Yeah.
Maybe you could think of it like a palm tree. Palm tree problem.
It's like an hourglass with all the sands at the top, and it takes a long time to get down to the interpretation and spreads out the application.
There you go. See, we just made it artsy. There you go.
Funnels are just cool.
There it is. It's an hourglass. And you have a little wicked witch over here.
Full personality.
So that's the model.
Why not stick a funny tree? So I was just like, that's just hard to do.
So the next thing in your notes, you've drawn your little model there. Like I hope you have. We're going to get into some steps. Obviously, when we get into some steps, this is how our model plays out, okay? Now, why is the model important? It's important because I'm going to have one of you draw the model and write as many steps as they can as a review every day, every year from now on. And I will pick at random. So, that's right. So, when we get into these steps, okay, we want to accomplish the model, right? So, there's our model. What do you guys think our first step is? Step 1. Let's do this together.
What is the genre?
Determine the genre. That's step 1. Determine the genre. Now, how would we go about that?
Find out what the book's name is.
Okay.
Who's the author?
Figure out your author. Sure. Yeah.
Well, maybe that's the historical.
So, determine the genre. So, maybe a sub-point here is that who is the author? Wow. There we go. So those are the questions we're going to be asking. Who's the author? Now, what else are we going to be asking to determine the genre?
Recognize the style.
Yes.
Is it poetry? Is it prophecy? Is it? I know that gets into genre, but the style.
Is it poetic? Right? So, there's poetic language obviously within some genres of scripture. So you want to be able to do that. When we talked a little bit about figurative language, you were talking about that in the idea of genre, right? So we came up with 3 sort of ways that people use figurative language. Just as a review, I forgot about this in our review. So in review, metaphors, allegories, parables. Okay? What is the difference? What is a metaphor? If I use a term metaphorically, what am I doing?
Word to another word.
There, I'm substituting a word for another word, right? Like, tear this temple down, or you are God's temple, Paul says to the church. You are his building. You are like stones, okay? He's not saying we're actually stones, is he? He's being metaphorical, okay? So the other way is to use a allegory. What's the difference between an allegory and a parable?
Parable has one singular, analogy going on.
Okay, great.
There's multiple analogies in an allegory.
There we go. So we'll call that a point of meaning, or an application, a single application. There's a single application in a parable, but there are multiple applications in an allegory. So who can be an example of when Jesus uses a parable? One of them, it's called a parable, but we don't use it in the English language. We wouldn't term that as a parable. One of them we said was the seeds, right? That's actually an allegory, because that's got multiple meanings. Or I'm sorry, applications. Well, what would be a parable?
The lost coin.
The lost coin. Great. Singular application. Okay, great. Okay, that was a review. Forget about that. So we determine the genre by asking who is the author, is it poetic, maybe...
Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but some books have poems surrounded by other things. Am I correct? There's like a poem in the middle of, trying to think of one example where there's right in the middle. I think in Samuel, there's poems throughout it. Am I accurate?
Yeah, so sometimes there'll be a song of Samuel, there'll be a song of Moses, and it's a narrative. It's actually just taking you through a historical narrative, but then they'll just bust out in this song.
Right.
So, yeah, you categorize that down into that song. And obviously you would, some of the Psalms actually say, this psalm was written after this. And well, that's very helpful. That helps us understand why they wrote the psalm. What was it in reaction to? Okay, so determine the genre. Okay, when we get into, is it poetic? We're actually kind of asking maybe a little more general statement would be, what is the style? Okay, who is the author? What is the style? Okay, and this is easy, right? This isn't rocket science. We can tell what the style is based on if it's a song or if it's a narrative or it's a letter or something like that, right? Letters are addressed to me. Okay, so that's not very hard. So determine the genre. That's step one. Great. You determine the genre. What's step two?
Context.
Context. It's just getting easy, isn't it? So we determine the context. So we determine the context. What are we really trying to do here when we determine the context? What are some things we want to take note of?
What's happening right now?
What's that?
What's happening right now? What's going on in that time frame? Right?
Okay, so let's say context, determine the context. What time period are we looking at?
Settings. Where are they?
What's that, Alex?
The settings. Where are they?
Yeah, okay, great. What time period? Where are they?
Who's talking to who?
Who is the audience?
Why? Why are they saying what they're saying?
Get a little bit into interpretation. Observation, we're not trying to come to any conclusions. We're just trying to observe some stuff, right? So, determining context, these are all great. What time period? Where are they? Who's the audience? Remember what our three context ideas were, right? Immediate. Okay, so if I'm reading just a specific passage, then I'm looking at,
What are they doing?
yeah, like maybe what was written before.
Wait, what do you mean by that? What was written before? This one, history.
Is that in
Historically?
the context of the entire Bible or?
The verse before, or like maybe the chapter before?
That's all around the brand.
Immediate.
So immediate. What's immediately written right before that little statement I'm reading? I'm studying, and I get called up. One of you ladies is like, "Hey, we're doing this study. We'd like you to come in as a guest speaker, and this is the scripture we're going to talk about." Ooh, okay. So now you better figure out what the immediate context is before you just start diving into that chapter. So let's figure out what the immediate context is. What was written right before then, and that's kind of what Robert was saying. What's happening? Right? What's going on? Okay, so that's the immediate context. Maybe you want to figure out what the context is of the book. Now, you know what? I'm not going to say that. The reason is because we're going to get that when we talk about time period and where they are, right?
Who, what, where, when?
Who, what, when, where, when. Right.
The top one is when.
What?
So the top one is when. It'd be when, where, who, and what.
Yeah.
Top one would
Yes.
be when.
When time period.
Yes.
That's right. I didn't even think about that, but we figured it out. There's your context. Anything else we want to know contextually?
The purpose of the lesson they're trying to get across.
No, that's kind of what Robert was talking about. That's getting into the interpretation. We're not there yet. We really want to get there, and but we got to be patient. There's one.
Is it the culture?
Yep, cultural context or historical, right? So we'll say historical, cultural context. Okay, so how do we figure that one out? That's a good question. It's not in the text sometimes, right? Sometimes we're not actually in the text of what some of the cultural norms are. Why is Boaz telling the guy to take his shoe off and walk through town with one shoe on, right? That's not, this doesn't spell it out for us in the book of Ruth, does it? So then he told him, took his shoe off, and he walked through town with his shoe. I might have to do a little bit of digging, okay?
Themselves in sackcloth and ashes.
All right, there you go. What's up with the sackcloth and ashes, right? So you might get into the Bible Hub website that you have there in your page 1 notes. You get in there and you actually look at the Bible encyclopedia they have there and look at the actual history going on. There might be some good questions. Now, typically you aren't really worried about the cultural context until you see something that seems strange, seems outside your culture, and then you go, okay, what is the deal with that? Don't just skip over it. These are little nuggets that are really fun. I mean, yeah, it turns out you take your shoe off and walk 2 towns. They didn't have contracts back then. There was eyewitnesses to say a deal went down. We all saw you walk through town with your shoe off. Don't go saying that you turned Ruth down with her land, okay? We all saw it. So the cultural context is important. There's a lot in the book of Ruth. It's, by the way, it's, wow, uncovers feet. What's that all about? I don't know. Okay, so we've determined the context. We've got historical context in here. This is good. This is where it takes a little time. You know, don't rush through when you're trying to get your interpretation. This isn't a race. So this is a line. Okay? Take your time. You want the gold, right? You're not trying to just rush through the day. This is your goal. Okay, so that is determining the context. Right? So I would say that if we're going to do this by steps, maybe step 1 is determine the context, and then maybe it's 1A, 1B. Step 2, 1A, 2A, 2B, 2C, whatever you want to do. Or you can just put them all down in different steps. Okay? Whatever you want to do. Sometimes it's simpler to have sub-steps. It depends on how your brain works. Not a big deal. But we want to make sure our steps are the same because you may not be working with the same group every time. So don't modify them. These are our steps. Okay? Okay, we determine the context. Anything else we need to ask for context? This is pretty thorough. You would do very well researching these things in your observation. Again, we're still in just the observation mode, right? There are 3 phases of observation. I feel like I should get a different color for number 3. I guess we have to do pink. That's all it's not. Okay, 3. Let's see. Now we got to do what? Determine
Grammar.
Determine grammar. Okay. So we're determining grammar. What do we got to do? What do we got to observe from grammar?
Conjunctions. Identify conjunctions.
Identify conjunctions. Okay. What else should we identify?
Look for the intended meaning?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet. We're going to get to that, but we're still just in observation mode. You're so eager to get the interpretation. Identify conjunctions. What about pronouns? Why would pronouns be important? When it says you, what are we talking about? Right? So maybe we need to identify conjunctions. Maybe we need to identify
The subject.
yes. I would say, identify the pronouns. Any pronouns that you see. You guys know what I mean by pronouns, right?
He, she.
He, she, you. It's not saying the name. So you have to determine.
I have to identify my pronouns every day now, so.
Well, it's what Robert said earlier about the subject. Who is the subject? When we say they or you, when David says they go about, plotting evil all the time, what's he talking about, right? So he's talking about his mom, parents. So So we got to figure out who our pronouns are referring to in a passage. For instance, somebody asked me the other day, it was about a letter, it was about 1 Corinthians 15. They said, couldn't it be that Paul is referring to a pagan practice because he's writing to pagans? I said, well, that depends on who we know the letter was written to. It was written to the Corinthian church. So the you in the Corinthian church is a plural you for the church. It's not written to some pagan, so we know it wasn't referring to some paganism going on inside the church. So pronouns are important. Of course, we've got other things like
Adjectives, verbs.
there we go. All the other stuff, right? Adjectives, adverbs. We got
Clause.
clauses. Okay, clauses can. There's a lot of clauses in Paul's statements, right? So, if-thens, right? So, of course, that's sort of like a conjunction. But anything else we want to observe in the grammar? So we got some adverbs here, we got some adjectives, pronouns, conjunctions. That's a big one. Identifying conjunctions, that's going to take some time, isn't it? If we're in Paul. Maybe it won't take very much time for reading narrative. So,
Nouns. Pronouns. Nouns. Nouns if it's an item, like a thing.
yeah. Yeah, if you want to identify the nouns and the,
Is the tense important?
yep, verb, and then you could go tense, verb tense. So that's very important. So we got 3 big steps. I put a bunch of steps on your paper because I didn't know how many we were going to come up with. Okay. Because I didn't know if you guys wanted to have these as separate steps. You can. Sometimes it's less is more, right?
You're not going to use all of the sub-steps.
Exactly. But you know you've got to differ on all this for your observation. Okay? So that's our observation. That's our observation. So after all these observations, right, and we've determined all this stuff and how it's all laid out, we can start coming away with some interpretation. So our third step, I'm running out of room. Okay.
So that's our third step, right?
You guys got us written down?
Well,
I'm going to erase it.
we're good.
This is great. I have to actually write this down. Good thing I'm recording it. Okay, so our fourth step would be,
One of the things I wrote down, I don't know if you consider this a step, but identifying whether it's a theological principle or a command. Seems like
determining if it's a theological principle
that's being discussed versus
or a command. Okay.
identify if those two things are in there. Seems important.
Yeah. Yeah, because if you're talking about a narrative, you might be able to draw out a theological principle, like Boaz was very generous to Ruth. Okay, if we're doing a narrative example. He noticed her hard work. Oh, there's another one. Look at hard work. Pays off, right? Look at Ruth. She loves her mother-in-law so much. She's going out there working hard and gathering up, gleaning what the reapers have left behind every day. He notices her and he's like, that woman's taking care of her. Well, there's a lot of really a lot of generosity and a lot of love going around, right? And so that's not the point necessarily that the author may be getting at, but it's certainly something we can draw from it, right? That's something we can say, that's a really cool application. But to say that's the interpretation, we've got to be very careful about that. So when we're talking about the 10 Commandments, right? Those are 10 Commandments. The idea here is that God is giving them 10 commands by which he will draw his moral code for the rest of the law. Okay? So, it's the basics. So, yeah, determining, how do you guys feel about that? Does that make sense, what we're saying? Do you guys want that to be in your steps?
Seems like maybe it's after interpretation is what it seems like, making the
Sure. So you
interpretation
want to put that
in the
application
observation.
category?
Yeah, so maybe it's more ahead of the application if the steps are being just observationally, or once we get into interpretation, we've passed observation at that point, correct?
Yeah, we're actually beyond observation at this point. We've sort of observed everything we possibly can. That we can actually now pull away and start saying, I don't want to say determine the interpretation. I want to say it in a more meaningful way. How would you say that more meaningfully? Hint, use the word meaning.
Meaningful interpretation.
Glean the meaning.
Glean the meaning.
What did the author,
Meaning.
what was the
Apprehending
meaning of the author's?
Yeah, apprehending the meaning of the author.
Yeah. Author's intended meaning. Yeah.
Author, okay, so this is a step, right?
Oh, what is the author's intended meaning?
What did the author mean?
For the audience, or is that too much? It's too wordy. Or is
What
it
did the
assumed?
author mean, right? Now, the audience is another step, right? We've observed a lot of things about the audience.
We already said that was in step 2. Who is the
Right,
audience?
who is the audience? So what did the author mean? That's obviously something that we all needed all that information before, because we're not saying is that some general meaning. He meant to say this to these specific people for a specific reason, okay? So we have the meaning. What did he mean? Okay? So what could also be asked is, if that's what he meant, okay, what was the reason he said it? Okay? I'm going to make that number 5. Okay, what was the reason? What was the reason he said it? Wrote it, whatever. Okay, so what was the reason he said it? What did the author mean? What was the reason he said it? Okay, that ties it back kind of into a little more of a clear statement back into the audience, okay, from our observations. And so if I was doing a Bible study, or I was teaching my kids, or I was talking to a friend, or I was doing my own personal study, that would actually be pretty helpful, because it ties all that stuff back in. Because remember, when you're doing a study, when you're actually doing a study, you're not taking everybody through all your observations.
Can I propose maybe thinking about just applying, like we were looking at it from a step-by-step process. We determine the grammar, and then maybe step 4 is applying the axioms, right? Because 2 of the axioms are objective is to apprehend the meaning of the author.
Okay.
And then words determine on how they're used, so identifying, what words are being used in that way. So maybe step 4 would be apply axioms.
Okay. I like that. You guys like that?
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like a self-check, right? It's like a.
Now apply those things that we know to be true.
Yeah, so let's say, well, we're going to call that number 4 then. Let's do a, what would you call that? When you're going back and making sure you're not breaking any rules, what is that?
Review axioms, or
Are you testing an initial hypothesis?
Kind of like, it's like a quality control, right? So quality control is like you go back through and say, okay, make sure nobody's cutting any corners here, right? We're not just coming away with something, some sort of interpretation that was from my own experience and that sort of thing. So we could just say step 4 is
Confirm.
applying axioms.
Confirm axioms are not broken.
yeah,
How about evaluating against the axioms and
evaluating.
Test against axioms.
Uh-huh.
Against the axioms. Nice. Evaluate against the axioms. Okay, that's step 4. So evaluate against the axioms. We're going to go back to the axioms and say, if I've broken anything, if Have I done all this right? Have I put everything in its order? Have I, you know what I mean? So that's kind of like a good review. That'll be really nice in your groups. Because you're like, okay, first axiom, right? So God, okay, so obviously the first one, we know that. God uses language. Language is just,
It's probably the last three. You're probably the ones.
there we go. Truth according to truth. You know, am I coming away, I seem to be coming away with some interpretations. Are any of those interpretations against the grain of what I would normally see in Scripture?
And then
Do we need to do the same thing for the rules of
logic.
logic?
So it seems like to me the next step would be now apply logic.
Okay. So 5, evaluate against rules of logic. Great. Yeah. Like that. Good job, guys. This is really turning out nice.
So then do we do the, what did the author mean and what was the reason the author said it after
Yeah.
those things?
Good with that? Pretty good with that? Okay, so 6. Let's say, we'll say determine again. Determine the meaning, the author's meaning. Determine the author's meaning.
It'd be better to say intent, or is that the next step? The author's intent, is that the next step?
I think that might, the intent would be the reason why he gave that meaning.
Okay.
When we come away with that, so maybe that's the next one, is the whole reason. What was his intent? Right, so we could go, that's an even simpler way to say it actually. So 7, what was his or her intent? Great. I love it. It's McDonald's. I'm loving it.
So what was their intent instead of the reason they said it?
Those seem like the same
That's what you're
thing.
saying?
Yeah, it's the same thing.
Okay,
I
so
just thought that was nicer.
tell me the
Which is also-
difference between meaning and intent.
So the meaning is the message that the author is getting across, the message. The intent is the reason why, and that would come back to the audience.
These are also the axioms though
Why
in
he
play.
said it?
Yeah, so
So it's still axiom 3 and then axiom 4.
yeah, so if Moses is like, you know, listen, you rebels, are we going to make water come out of this rock? Okay, now we know the meaning. You know, he's saying, he's insulting the children of Israel for grumbling, and then he's asking a rhetorical question: do I have to make water come out of this rock? Why? Well, I think his sister just died, I think. And, you know, we see all kinds of things going on. I'm grumbling still. There's this persistence and hardship in leadership, and he disobeys God and what he does. But we can understand his intention behind what he's saying. He wants their respect, right? So we can kind of come away with his intent, though it would be wrong. There was a reason he said what he said, but there's also what he said. The message he was getting across. If I tell my kids, right, if you don't clean up your room, you're going to bed for the rest of the night. Okay? The meaning is pretty clear. There's a consequence if they don't clean up their room. But why did I say it like that? Because they've been naughty all day. They haven't listened to anything I've said, right?
So with that, the intentions behind it. So where does that fit in?
So that's the intent, the intention, okay, has to do with the audience, right? So the intention here, for instance, the Corinthian church is a great example. Why does Paul have to remind the Corinthian church not to sleep with prostitutes? because they were sleeping with prostitutes, right? They were going to the temple and they were engaging in all this immorality. And he was having to tell them, hey, you know, don't you know if somebody makes himself one with a prostitute, or sleeps with a prostitute, makes himself one flesh with a prostitute. So he's not just teaching them some random theological knowledge. It's what is important that they know it. That's the intention behind why are they saying what they're saying.
So it's kind of determined by his emotional state at that point when he's writing.
I would say it has to do with that ties into it. It has to do with the context of why the audience needed to hear it, right? So, yeah, and you know, we got to be careful about emotional state. We don't want to make it. If it's a narrative, we can definitely see emotional state.
Yeah.
If somebody's writing for God, you know,
Yeah.
we're not going to put an emotional state in there. For obvious reasons. Okay. So we've determined the author's meaning and why they said it, right? What was his or her intent behind what they said? That's great. We determined that. That's wonderful. You're gonna be able to write that conclusion. That's the intent. Okay. Now that we know, based on all the observations, we determine the author's meaning with the interpretation and why they said what they said. What's step 8?
What action do I have to take?
There we go. Nice. Okay. What's this got to do with me, right? So, yeah. Before, you know what, let's make that 2 parts. I'm gonna go 8. I'm gonna go 9. 9 is what action? What action ought I take? Okay? But the first one is like, how does this apply to me? Or me, us, them, right, etc. Obviously, if you're doing a Bible study, you might want to know how it applies to us or them. Or preaching, how does it apply to them? But if it's just your personal one, you're going to say, how does it apply to me?
I think maybe this is where we drop in just identifying what theological principle, or if it's a command, maybe that's the step ahead, right? Of is this a theological principle based off of all the things we just learned about what the person is, the meaning of the author, then applying, okay, what theological principle is this person talking about, maybe in the general terms, or is this a command in which they're kind of, and then that way we can figure out how do we apply it in our lives. Is this a principle we apply it in our lives, or is this something where already the action kind of comes into play?
That's a good question. Maybe what we need to do in number 8 is say, we should be asking, does this directly apply to me? Right? Children, obey your parents, for this is the will of the Lord.
Can I ask a question, Sam?
Yes, Kurt.
So we talked about looking at the immediate history, or what's written immediately before, but shouldn't it be evaluated within the broader body of Scripture? So if you're 2/3 of the way through the Old Testament, for example, shouldn't you be looking at everything that has come before? If you're in the New Testament, comparing that to prophecies and depending on what the subject matter is,
Right.
shouldn't it be viewed with, shouldn't you take what you've gotten so far and where you're headed with your interpretation,
Let's
and then
add
compare it to the whole body of Scripture?
Let's add that back in our observations under context. Let's put not just the book, but
Not just
the
the
context of Scripture. Let's do that. That's a good point. We got that? I'm gonna have to like fill all this out. When I get home. Ooh, look at that. We got 10 steps. That's fun. 8, 9, 10. Sorry, the colors don't match. That's okay, I'll erase them a little bit. Great. So we got 10 steps. Some of them have plenty of subsets. I think 10's okay. We're doing good. Now, we've kind of come to this together, and you guys have done a really great job because you're actually remembering everything that we talked about. You see, all the observation stuff we talked about, you're the ones who've actually plugged this in and thought about it, which is great. It's the whole goal. It's not that I just deliver all the steps to you, because sometimes when that happens, the group may not jive with it, right? But if everybody agrees, these are good steps, 2 good 10 steps, this is great. So what action ought I take? Of course, you could say we, us, right? Substitute that as a result of this. Are we doing good? Okay, so what I would like to do is take us through an example before we're done. Okay, and we're going to work through those steps together, which you already have your steps written down. You can help me out. All right, we're going to go through an example. You guys want to take a break before we do that? Yes. Okay, let's take a break. Use restroom, whatever you do. Don't worry about the camera's just going to keep rolling, but I cut all that stuff up. So it's okay. Take a break. And Brian.
Yeah.
So it's funny, I was thinking about.
All right. Turn your Bibles to Romans chapter 11. Romans chapter 11. That's right. Nice. Get wet. I will jump in here. Okay. We got a little worksheet here on the side. Right? We have a little, there we go. Let's try as I demonstrate how this works. Take notes as practice. Here we go. So, Romans 11. We pick up in verse 28. As regards the gospel, they are enemies of God for your sake. But as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. For just as you were at one time disobedient to God, but now have received mercy because of their disobedience, so they too have been disobedient in order that by the mercy shown to you, they also may now receive mercy. For God has consigned all to disobedience, that he may have mercy on all. So that's the passage.
Holy cow.
Yeah. So we got what? Let's see. Okay, so that's the passage. What do we do first?
Determine the genre.
Okay, determine the genre. Anybody know what the genre is?
It's a letter.
It's a letter. Okay, that's that easy. What else do we have under genre? We have author.
Who's the author? It's Paul.
Paul. Good. So the author is Paul.
That's this.
So we're looking at Romans 11, 28 through 32. Thank you. Okay, so the author is Paul. The genre is that it's a letter. Anything else? What do we have in that step?
Who is the author? What is the style?
Style. Great. So we've determined that's a letter. Okay. So that's it?
Yep.
Okay. I didn't memorize the steps. We just learned. So the second, so now we got step 1 done. Cool. That was easy. Step 2 of 10. What's the next step?
Context.
Great. Okay, context. What are our contact points? What's the first one?
When?
What is the time period?
Time period. Anybody know the answer to that?
Early church.
Early church. Okay. This was
AD 100-ish. All right, so pre-AD 100, so between AD 30 and 100, right?
right. So if we wanted to know when this was written, where Paul was, okay, he was actually at the end of his 3rd missionary journey. Doesn't say that though, does it?
Mm-hmm.
Where would we go to find that information?
Bible Hub.
Bible Hub. Great. So Bible Hub's going to help you out with all that. Okay, so we figure out when it was written. Great. That's our context, our cultural, sort of our time period context, where we are in the life of the Apostle Paul.
Does it say somewhere in, like whether it's Corinthians or Thessalonians or whatever, like when his third missionary trip was? Would we identify it somewhere in the text?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, so he would have written, okay, so right. So he writes to the Romans. There would be some indication in the text where he was based on his introduction and sort of like his final greetings. We can see some people that are sending things different places and that sort of thing. Now, let me ask you this. We got to be careful, right, that we don't over-observe. What I mean is, okay? What I mean is, we're dealing with the specific passage, right? So we want to ask the right context questions about the actual passage that we're in. Okay? So there are some helpful cultural things that we need to observe, but we need to observe some of the language here, right? Like, regards to election. What's that all about? Are we talking about elected before the foundation of the earth? No.
Or identifying who is they.
There we go. There's a pronoun.
We're not there yet.
We're not there yet.
No?
Thanks for hitting the brakes. That was me, my fault. Okay, so let's say we don't have to get too much into context for this specific passage. Okay? Sometimes it's helpful if you're doing a sermon or you're doing like a Bible study, you're just dropping in, but sometimes people have already kind of covered all that. So you're just getting into the context of what is he referring to? What does he mean?
Well, so this is to the church in Rome, so that's part of what we want to know.
Yes.
So that's who's the audience.
Right, and we would want to know whether those were primarily Jews or Gentiles, right?
I know this sounds ridiculous too, but it's like identifying after Jesus' death, right? It's as simple as that. It's like just kind of frameworking, because if we're going back to Old Testament passage, like knowing where in the chronological timeline it is, right?
Yep.
So some basic things like that for most of us.
Exactly. So if we're looking, let me just write this down. So we're on context now, right?
Yeah.
And we said one of the things we have to worry about with context is we're worried about, one of the things was the immediate, right?
Immediate,
so the immediate
versus,
context is important.
What was written right before it.
Exactly. We want to maybe look back and take a look at
Start there first.
like an argument that's going on here, because he gets an as regards. Do you realize what we just found? We just found whereas is a reason.
Beginning of the sentence.
As is.
As regards the gospel, right? So there we go.
Okay.
Who would have thought? You would pick that verse just to nail on it.
Cool. Truth, of course, the truth. Okay.
Okay, so
The immediate context is probably the best place to start in step 2. The immediate context.
Right.
Let's just figure out, okay, where, in what is chapter 11 about?
well, go back. You can go back as far as 25
Oh yeah.
because he's talking about. I don't want you to be unaware of the mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, and in this way all Israel will be saved. So he's talking about the salvation of Israel.
And then he gives an Old Testament quote there. And he says it's fulfilled. Okay? In other words, as it's written. It's not fulfilled, sorry. Back up. He says, as it is written. Okay? So he's saying their salvation is fulfilled in this specific prophecy. Okay, that's in Isaiah 59. You should have that in your little footnotes. That's legal. A study Bible I see there, Debbie? Huh? Study Bible?
No, she doesn't have study Bible. That's our one for Bible Institute.
Very good.
Should we do it to inspection
You
before
see this
class?
pause? She's like, she's not talking to me. Papers? You see your papers? So you have this, and then you have an analogy given in here in the very beginning, this grafted in analogy. Okay, how the the Jews were broken off so that the Gentiles could be, this wild olive shoot could be put on a cultivated olive shoot to produce fruit. Okay? So, lest you be wise in your own sight, right? And we understand this mystery, brothers, a partial hardening. So this partial hardening has to do with what? What was their partial hardening? What did it look like?
They rejected the Messiah.
They rejected the Messiah. Perfect. They rejected the Messiah. That was the partial hardening that's come over them, right? Okay.
Okay, hold on. I'm
Yes.
lost on where we are.
Yeah.
Still like
We're doing
context.
immediate context.
Okay.
We're just trying to understand everything leading up to this word as, which is the reason he's saying it. We want to understand what is the reason
Okay,
that Paul
so,
is getting at.
okay.
So you're
So
going
time period is early church. Where they are is Jews that are in Rome, the early church in Rome that are Jews. Or
That's who he's
No.
speaking to.
I think it's a mixed
Or
crowd. I would
Christians.
say it's a mixed
Okay.
crowd. These are just Christians.
just
Jews, and
Christians,
Gentiles.
Jews and Gentiles, okay. But that are in Rome, the
Right.
church in Rome.
Because this is like
Okay.
it's almost like an op-ed in a newspaper, right? He's just sending it out for those people in Rome to read.
Right.
Okay.
Great. Great. Those are all observations, right? So he does this whole, we observe this little dialogue about this partial hardening. He has a word picture, an illustration earlier. We're not studying that. We just want to make sure that we are going into this right. He talks about how the deliverer will come out of Zion, will banish all ungodliness from Jacob. This will be the covenant with them when I take away their sins. That's Isaiah 59. Now, I'm not going to go there for the sake of time. But if you go back to that, Isaiah 59 is Israel's salvation just after the world is judged. Israel is saved, and then the glory of Israel is manifested in the reign of God when God comes and reigns, right? And he restores Israel all of its glory, okay? So, we have a partial hardening before, he says in verse 28, as regards the gospel, okay? So, the immediate context, we could explain to me the immediate context of what was the point he just made leading into this point?
The rejection of the Messiah, the gospel. He's talking about, the way I look at this, he's talking also to the Gentiles, that they are your enemies for the sake of the gospel.
Okay, so in the actual thing here, it says as regards. So as is the reason, so that's why we went back. Regards is the gospel. Okay. They, who are they?
The people of Israel.
Okay, the Jews, right? Yeah. So the people of Israel. Israel in general, the Jews who have rejected Christ. We know that. That's the pronoun based on what we looked at before. They are enemies, okay? Are enemies. That's I think that's a predicate, but it's basically are. It's not were or will be, okay? Are, present, okay? Enemies of God for your sake. Enemies of God for your sake. But, which is a what?
Conjunction.
It's a conjunction. So we're expecting what kind of conjunction? What is but? What kind of conjunction is it? Is it comparison?
Sure.
No, it's a
Contrast.
contrast, right? So but is a contrast. So he's contrasting.
So are we moving into grammar now? Are we done with context?
Sorry. We are just done with context.
Okay, wait.
Yeah, we're having
I
to
don't
do
have the
context.
rules.
We're having to do
I don't have the
context and
rules.
grammar at the simultaneously.
Okay, so right, so you're gonna use.
We
yeah,
did not talk about context in all of Scripture.
That's true.
So do we care about that? Because sometimes we're
I
not
don't-
going to care, right?
I think that context as far as all scripture, that's a great question. It's something that we probably ought to think about. And we did say a few things about that as far as this was after Christ was resurrected. This is clearly the New Testament. This is during the first century church. This is one of the letters to the existing churches in that time. So when it comes to what he's saying in that time, we've already kind of ascertained that this isn't like an Old Testament instruction. This is instruction to the early church.
funny because as regards as is used as a comparison because it goes on, but as regards election, those two things. So he's saying as regards the gospel and as regards election, he's comparing two things. Isn't that right?
Well, the but would be the actual one that's a contrast. So the as is simply, like here I have in verse 28, as regards the gospel, but in this one, but as regards election.
So it says they are the enemies for your sake, but in election they are, so going back to the Jews, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. So it's comparing from this perspective of the gospel in the perspective of election, right? So it's comparing.
But let's just be, before we move to too much grammar, we're good with context.
Yeah.
You good with step 2? Doesn't have to be perfect right now. Okay? We're gonna say,
So you said it's instruction to the church. Where did we say that?
what's that?
Just because because it's a letter to the church, it's instructions to them?
Right.
Is that what you're saying?
I'm not saying this specifically.
Okay.
I was just saying Romans in general.
Oh, okay.
So so if we're good with context, we have enough context that we're pretty sure we can work with it. If not, we can always go back. If he says something weird that we're like, well, I don't know, that's strange. That's strange culturally. I can't apprehend that. I might have to go back. Okay, do some more digging after I've done some of my grammar work. That'll happen. It's not like when you've completed the step, you move on to the next one, you can't go back. Sometimes you have to go back. It's okay. Well, let's move to grammar, okay? So when it comes to grammar, we've observed some pronouns, okay? So when you have all this written out, you'll underline all your pronouns. You, your sake. Obviously, we want to identify which pronouns are what. We've already identified who the they are, which is good. So when you're writing this out, you can put Israel, or unbelieving Israel, or something like that above they, all right? But they are enemies of God for your sake, right?
Sure.
Your sake
So is the church he's writing to?
right. It's the recipients of the letter of the Roman Church.
Or more specifically, that would be the Gentiles.
Well,
Because the Jews rejected Messiah.
right.
The good news has come to the Gentiles in the church. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
That would be good. That would be a good observation. Yeah.
If you look at 13, verse 13, now I'm speaking to you Gentiles, in as much then, so in identifying the fact that he's saying specifically to the Gentiles, at one portion he's talking to everybody, and in some portions he's identifying specifically to Gentiles. So maybe the assumption is going to be within this chapter, he's drawing a wide net as to who he's talking to. And then when identifying the Gentiles, he's doing it ahead. So maybe,
That's perfect. That's a great observation. Good catch. So we identify first of all. Okay. Are there any verbs here? Just observing some grammar. That's all. We're not trying to. It's so hard, guys, to not try to interpret this right away. Okay. What are we noticing in verbs? Any verbs? 28 through 32.
disobedient. It's an action of doing something.
It's a judgment. It's the judgment is that they were disobedient.
Isn't that a verb?
Have now been
To do something?
disobedient.
Now been disobedient. So
Yeah, now.
been disobedient. I guess that been disobedient would be a past tense.
Disobedience.
Right.
Isn't the verb of being?
Or loved.
Which is in the next line, because,
Have now
but
been.
now have received mercy because of their disobedience.
Okay, so received.
Past verb.
Yep. Received. Good.
And consigned. For God has consigned all to disobedience. That
Okay,
you
so
may-
God is consigned. Yep, that's a verb.
Mercy.
They have mercy. So to have something. Verbs are typically action. Having mercy is like to have mercy on someone is definitely an action, but it's more of a description of an action. When I did that, when I let that guy go, I didn't make him pay his debt, I was having mercy on him, right? But you're getting the idea.
So, and
Calling,
receive.
calling's a verb, isn't it? The calling of God, isn't
The
that?
gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable.
So the calling, is that an action word?
The calling
I think that's
is
a
the
thing.
idea.
That's a noun. That's a
Yeah, it's a
thing.
noun, yeah, because gifts and calling are
Yeah.
the same. But received,
Depends on the word usage, right?
Hmm?
Could be.
Same
I
with
called
mercy.
you.
That's
I was calling you.
mercy too.
received is a verb.
Received is a past tense verb. So, and again, remember the tense, okay? It's a past tense verb. Okay, and there's tons of nouns here. I'm not going to get into that. What about some conjunctions? Do we see any conjunctions? We already saw as,
Because.
Or
for, good.
Because.
You have because in yours? So I'm hearing at ESV, you guys may have more conjunctions, different conjunctions.
Oh, I thought mercy because of their disobedience, verse 30.
There you go, because, but they are beloved for the
Yeah,
sake
I know
of
that.
their forefathers, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable, for just as you were called at one time, disobedient, but now have received mercy
In
because of their disobedience.
In
So, that's another one. They too have now been disobedient in order that by the mercy shown to you, they also is a comparison.
is in order.
You see in order? Yep.
Yeah, yeah.
In order that.
In order
Yep,
that.
in order that. Yep.
31.
And we know that these conjunctions are all purposes, reasons, results, right? Comparisons, contrasts. You see that? So as we're sort of digging this out, we're sort of pulling these words out or identifying them based on what we already know about these conjunctions.
Maybe something that jumps out just in that, what maybe going on to axioms, I guess, is but in regards to election, what is election? What does he mean
Great.
by election?
Culturally, what did he mean? What does that word mean, election? Now, I don't want to say culturally even, but just biblically, how does Paul use that word, election?
Believers?
How did he use it there? How about the saved,
The saved,
right?
yeah.
So believers would be saved. So yeah, believers. So the idea of election here, he's talking about the Jews. Now, if it were referring to, because this would contradict, and not one, you can't have a contradiction where they're both the same. So if Paul is saying that the Jews are elect and the Gentiles aren't, we've got big problems, right? So what does he mean by election in this statement? Election and calling.
Well, because he's saying they are beloved because of their forefathers,
So it was the
And we
choosing
are-
of.
but the Gentiles are, that doesn't apply to the Gentiles.
Exactly. So
So they were the elected, the chosen people of
Because of
God.
like
So when
Abraham,
you're talking about
Isaac, Jacob. all those.
his promise to the Jews in regards to his promise because they were elected, this is also true.
So if we were to write this out, but instead of using some of the conjunctions, we replaced it with result or because or the reason, we replaced those conjunctions with either result, reason, or result or purpose, we would say as regards the gospel, they are enemies of God for your sake. Contrastingly, okay, that's a but. Contrastingly, as regard to election, they are beloved. The reason is the word for, right? The reason is because of the sake of their forefathers. You see how that's a lot more clear? You see that? So when I actually say, okay, that is actually what that's saying, any of these words mean that, you go, oh! So the reason why they're elect is because of their forefathers. Okay? And the reason for that is that the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Shove that one in the face of your covenant friend who says that the church has replaced Israel, right? Forever replace Israel. No, they're irrevocable. To not be revoked. God made a promise. That promise is going to stand. According to this, Okay, we're still kind of new grammar here. The reason, okay, for the reason, just as you were at one time disobedient to God, contrastingly, now have received mercy because of their disobedience. So, okay, so, you guys remember which one that was?
Purpose.
Purpose. The purpose is that they too have now been disobedient in order that, what's in order that?
Purpose.
For the purpose that by the mercy shown to you, they, by comparison, we're substituting also, by comparison, may now receive mercy. The reason is because God has co-signed all to disobedience. The reason for that, the result, that is a result, right? The result is that he may have mercy on everybody. Everybody.
So what does consigned mean? God has consigned all to disobedience. What does that mean?
That's great. Consigned. We have to look up dictionary definition on that word. So, con means with, right?
Yeah, he's made true.
So
this is being applied to everyone. Consigned all to obedience, meaning he's applying this to all. He's
determined.
He's determined.
Yeah, he's determined that this is going to be the way it's going to be. He's allowing people to openly rebel him on purpose with their own faculties. He's allowing them to do that. Because even when they do that, it means there's more mercy for more. And which is why, by the way, if we're looking at immediate context, he just busts out in 33. Oh, the depths of the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God, right? He's made some profound point. Now, if you're just reading that, and you come to verse 33, you see that O, what's O? What is that? What conjunction is that?
Emphasis.
Emphasis, right? He's emphasizing, he's shouting this out. He gets poetic, right? The depths of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways. You can't find the end of it, and you can't find anything wrong with any of it. Right? Unscrutable. So it's perfect and it's deep. If you don't have that reaction, it's probably because you didn't interpret it right. Right? So when we're looking at these conjunctions and we're looking at these, and we're running out of time. Okay? Well, we'll do a review next time, I promise. As we're going through our steps. We're just in the observation, the third portion of our observation. Of course, the interpretation and everything comes as a result. That's when you do your interpretation. Okay, put a sub thing underneath what did the author mean by what he said, whatever that was. You know what I'm talking about?
The reason.
Step 6.
What was his intent?
Determine the author's meaning? Or
Yeah, determine the author's meaning. That one.
So step 6.
I want you to put under there, write it out in your own words.
Simply restate your interpretation.
There you go.
They're in not our interpretation, but from what we think he is meaning, simply state what he's meaning. So I put simply restate the interpretation.
Simply restate the interpretation. So great. Is that clear? So the reason we want to do that is because we want to be sure when we're coming to an interpretation, we'll kind of land that plane into our interpretation. We've done all of our observing, we've looked at all the conjunctions, and sort of we're going to have paper, you have room to write all over that thing. And I just want you to just kind of go crazy. All right? It's going to be a lot of fun. There may even be some debates. Hopefully there'll be no fights. What we're going to do is, from that point, you're going to be able to mark all that up and then come away with some fun applications, right? So that's all we have time for right now, but we have time for questions.
Your format.
It was a lot, right? You guys are doing really great. I know you're writing a lot of stuff down. This is all gonna be, I will try to get this published tonight, okay? So we've got a couple people that are missing, and they told me they were gonna be missing, okay? So we're gonna have this up tonight. If you wanna review it, feel free. Because when we come together next time, we're just gonna, we'll do a review. One of you will write the model down. You won't have to write down all the steps, but I want you to be able to just write the model down, okay? And then, and have your conjunctions memorized. That's the challenge. You don't have to. I'm just telling you, it's going to be a lot easier. You'll be able to just substitute reason, result, purpose, compare, contrast. If then.
So consign someone to deliver.